Dr. Carter yet. I've submitted my PhD, but I am still currently Mr. Carter. So I'm going to talk about the far right and the Islamic extremist movements in Britain, and more specifically the relationship between the two and how that can develop to... Sorry, is that better? Can you hear me? So, sorry. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the far right and Islamic extremist movements in Britain, and more specifically the relationship between the two, and how that can develop to kind of radicalize people involved. Okay, so as background, in terms of the Islamic extremist movement in Britain, the main organization there is Al-Muhajirun, which is Arabic for the emigrants. These were formed in 1986 and operated until 2004, when they disbanded under pressure from the British government, who were threatening to proscribe them under the 2000 Terrorism Act. What they then did is reform with the same people involved under a different name, and this pattern of being proscribed, disbanding, reforming kind of has continued really to the present day. In terms of the far right, the specifically anti-Muslim social movement is referred to as the counter-jihad in Britain and also throughout much of Europe as well. In Britain, this kind of dates back to 2009, when the actions of an Al-Muhajirun Front organization who were protesting against British soldiers returning from active duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. This provoked a number of far-right organizations and football hooligans to counter-protest this, and this kind of coalesced into an organization called the English Defence League, who since then have been far and away the most significant and the biggest counter-jihad movement, who have been able to mobilize thousands of people on the streets throughout the years. Now, crucially, members of both movements have been involved in both successful and attempted but foiled terrorist attempts. And in fact, this year alone, there has been 3 lethal terrorist attacks committed by Islamist extremists in Britain. There was actually another one a week or two ago, on 25th of August, when a man attacked some police officers in Buckingham Palace and was apprehended. There has also been a terrorist attack against the Muslim community by a white British man who drove a van into a group of Muslims outside of a mosque in North London, killing one, injuring many more. Now, these interactions and actions of both these movements have led to observers, journalists, academics, and policymakers to view this episode through the lens of what has been termed cumulative extremism. This was a concept defined by the political scientist Roger Eatwell as the way in which one form of extremism can feed off and magnify other forms. This is also referred to as interactive escalation, reciprocal radicalization, tit-for-tat radicalization. It has a number of terms, but at core, all of these things are concerned with an antagonistic relationship developing between opposing social movements, with the worry that there will be a radicalizing influence on all involved, leading potentially to spirals of violence. The problem with this is it's remained an understudied and misunderstood topic for the most part, and there is a danger that it can over-exaggerate the threat of violent radicalization. Moreover, when counter-terrorism policies are being informed by these ideas and are being informed on an exaggerated threat of political violence, there is a worry that civil liberties are at threat, that the counter-terrorism apparatus will be given excessive powers. Now, my doctoral research has been based on a comparative historical analysis of 2 episodes of movement, counter-movement mobilization. Firstly, I studied fascists and anti-fascists in Britain throughout the 20th century, where there was some degree of violent radicalization, but never to the point of the sustained use of lethal violence. In fact, there wasn't really lethal violence used at all. And I've compared and contrasted this with the early years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where there was an escalation from an entirely non-violent civil rights movement to what was very famously a bloody and protracted ethnic conflict. And in so doing, I've developed a framework which I believe allows people to assess the likelihood of violent radicalization occurring when opposing social movements are mobilizing against each other. This framework consists of 3 areas of variables that are grouped together thematically. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go through every variable I've identified as being important, but rather I'm going to select some of the more salient points that are particularly pertinent to the contest between the counter-jihad and the far right. So the first area is the social bases themselves, the social movement organizations, and the conflict cleavages. Now, the conflict cleavage, that is the nature of the division between the opposing movements. This can either be ascriptive or non-ascriptive. So it can either be ascriptive as in ethnic, national, racial, or non-ascriptive as in ideological. On the whole, interactive escalation is more likely to occur when the cleavage is ascriptive. When the cleavage is non-ascriptive, there's a possibility that both opposing movements will be competing for support from the same social base, and this necessarily inhibits the use of indiscriminate lethal violence. In Northern Ireland, the paramilitaries of both sides, their frequent attacks on civilians of their opposing ethnic group fueled and magnified the violence there, while the fact that fascists and anti-fascists in Britain were competing for the same social base, i.e. the white working class, this necessarily inhibited their use of violence. Now, currently, while members of both the counter-jihad and Islamist movements are to a certain extent motivated by ascriptive communal concerns such as economic competition between groups and exclusion by the dominant ethnicity, for the most part, it's ideological. I mean, members of both sides are motivated by opposition to or support for the proliferation of radical Islam. Now, compared to places like Northern Ireland, where there was a deep-seated ascriptive division on a societal scale, these circumstances are far less likely to engender interactive escalation. Now, the second point of this area is the relationship between social movement organizations and their prospective social bases, and this does have a very strong influence on how a movement-counter-movement contest will develop. Now, simply put, the greater the extent to which the organizations and the social bases, the greater extent to which the organization's aims are generally perceived as representing those of their social base, and the greater the extent to which they are perceived as threatening the material and symbolic interests of other groups, the more likely processes of cumulative extremism or interactive escalation are to develop. So in Northern Ireland, where the goals of the largely speaking Catholic civil rights movement, which were reformation of the state, and the goals of the largely, or overwhelmingly, Protestant loyalist movement, which were the maintenance of the status quo, were not only mutually exclusive, but were to a greater or lesser extent the same material and symbolic interests of the two broader communities who were the support bases for the two opposing movements. Now, currently, the British Muslim community, on the whole, considers Islamist extremists' aims and interests to be wholly at odds with their own. Their extreme interpretation of Islam is seen as odious, and their actions tend to make life far more difficult for other British Muslims. This has, in large part, meant that the Islamist movement has never been more than a tiny, if disproportionately dangerous, fringe group. Similarly, the counter-jihad has failed to frame their aims and objectives as corresponding to those of the broader British public. Some recent large N opinion polls have found that, amongst other things, 85% of people would never join the EDL, and 61% of respondents felt that organisations like the English Defence League are stirring up hatred and violence between groups and making the risk of terrorist attacks more likely. Needless to say, few people consider this to be in the interests of their community. Okay, so the second area is the interactions between the opposing movements. Now, the main question to ask here is how coupled the movements involved are. Coupling is a term that social movement theorists use which refer to the rate and degree to which one group reacts to their opponents. Groups can be more or less tightly or loosely coupled. The more a movement's tactics and choice of arenas to operate in are influenced by a counter-movement, the more tightly coupled the conflict is. Groups can also be asymmetrically coupled if one group is more focused on their enemies and vice versa. Now, on the whole, the more symmetrically and tightly coupled opposing groups are, the more likely they are to radicalize each other, as they encounter each other more frequently, creating more opportunities to develop animosities and are on the whole fairly central to each other's political programs. In Northern Ireland, the groups involved were extremely tightly and symmetrically coupled, opposing each other at every opportunity, and this contributed to the murderous hatred they felt for each other. With regards to the counter-jihad and Islamists, they are extremely asymmetrically coupled. The Islamists very rarely actively mobilize to counter the actions of the counter-jihad and more or less ignore them as a movement. This mitigates processes of radicalization by lessening opportunities for the two groups to interact. This is one reason this episode has not escalated further and will likely be a continuing barrier to escalation in the future as well. Okay, so the third area is the environmental factors, the context in which the contest is occurring. So the first thing to consider here is what is referred to by political scientists as the structure of political opportunities. That is, the arrangement of various exogenous social and political factors which influence the development, tactics, and impact of social movements. One of the most important aspects of the structure of political opportunities is the degree to which people feel they can affect genuine political change through formal institutional means, such as political campaigning or even just voting. If institutional channels of political redress are closed to people, they will likely start to employ tactics of direct action, civil disobedience, or even political violence. In Northern Ireland, the most important single contributing factor to the radicalization of the Catholic community in the late 1960s was the fact that they were effectively excluded from the political decision-making process. Fortunately, in Britain, there is strong evidence that these conditions are wholly absent. Recent studies have shown that British Muslims are more likely to have trust in the government than Christians were, and that Britain's Muslim population feels comparatively more able to exert influence upon the system. Further, while there has definitely been a drop in trust for politicians amongst the British public as a whole, there is still a widespread feeling that Britain is a democratic country and that Britain's system is one of the best in the world, rightly or wrongly. Okay, so the other major element of the political structure of opportunities is how the state acts towards one or all of the movements concerned. Now, the often careless way in which public policy was applied in Northern Ireland frequently had the effect of actually radicalizing the Catholic community. Many interventions, such as the introduction of internment in 1971, backfired hugely and with an enormous radicalizing influence on the Catholics, giving more support to the Irish Republican Army than anything they themselves could have engineered, after it became very clear that the Catholics were the only one being targeted and the Protestant population was overlooked with this policy. When counter-terrorism policies designed to mitigate the escalation of a conflict are applied unevenly, focusing on one side at the expense of the other, the likely result is the opposite of what was intended. Unfortunately, the government's current counter-terrorism prevent agenda is much maligned amongst British Muslims, as its first iterations focused exclusively on Islamic extremism. More recent iterations of the policy have been broadened to include both extreme right-wing and Northern Irish-related extremism, which has gone some way to improving the situation. But nevertheless, there is little doubt that many British Muslims still feel somewhat persecuted by the strategy. However, for the time being, there is little evidence that this has led to the kind of radicalization experienced amongst Ulster Catholics in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Okay, so going forward, it does seem that under the current conditions in Britain, it's highly unlikely that cumulative extremism or interactive escalation will develop to a significant degree. And certainly the more alarmist assessments of some observers should be taken critically, despite several terrorist attacks this year by both sides. While this has provoked a spike in violence against Muslims and mobilizations of the counter-jihad, as is to be expected, this has, on the whole, as it has done in the past, ebbed away. There hasn't been any long-term hasn't been any kind of long-term shift in tactics or commitment. However, that does not mean that we should be complacent. In order to best guard against developments in the future, it is necessary to be aware of potential and extant grievances of the underlying communities, chiefly speaking, the British Muslim and white working class communities. Now, in terms of the former, this is often feelings of alienation, isolation, and discrimination. At a bare minimum, this would require conducting more work in ensuring that counter-terrorism policies, such as the aforementioned PREVENT agenda, aren't constructed in such a way that British Muslims feel persecuted or that they feel that their community is being securitized. In terms of the latter, it seems that anxieties around economic uncertainties is a strong motivational force for involvement in the counter-jihad movement. Many criminologists in Britain have linked economic policies of austerity to the popularity of groups such as the English Defence League, and generally speaking to the far right, actually. Tackling these feelings of economic anxieties amongst this group will go some way in starving the counter-jihad support, and so may mitigate future radicalisation of this conflict. Thank you.